This is the Game Changers Experience. Deep dive conversations with leading business disruptors, Olympic athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and influencers from around the world. This show will teach you insights about the winning principles in mindset, productivity, marketing, branding, entrepreneurship, business strategy, and more. Hosted by Productivity Authority, business strategist, former elite athlete, author, and public speaker, Adam Strong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Game Changers Experience with myself, Adam Strong. We have another amazing guest here on the show today. Someone who's a little bit different, got got some amazing experience, especially in the corporate world. And I'm going to introduce her really, really shortly. We were just talking offline, and it was really fascinating to learn about how she has really advanced her career at such a young age. And we're going to delve into what she's learned from being COO at the age of 24 through to someone that she is now, which is, former CEO and, entrepreneur and speaker and things like that. So who we got on the show today, ladies and gents? Well, we've got the amazing Victoria Pelletier, who is, like I said, she has got a wealth of experience, like an absolute wealth of experience. And she is, she's worked with some credible companies, credible companies such as IBM, and IBM actually voted her as the number one social seller through LinkedIn and stuff like that. So that's a really big thing. She's also recognized as one of the top most influential business leaders in tech. She has also been awarded Mentor of the Year in 2021. And she is an inclusive and diversity champion as well, which I'm always a big fan of in terms of like women's empowerment and stuff like that, which I absolutely love. She is currently one of the managing directors of Accenture, which is a big consulting group as well. She's got a plethora of experience in executive boards and things like that. Now, some of the things that we're going to be covering in today's show, ladies and gents, is we're going to be covering what I'm going to be diving in deep around Victoria's experience. Being CEO at the age of 24 is quite an achievement. And we're going to be talking about some of her leadership lessons. We're going to be talking about her principles. We're going to be talking a little bit about culture. We're going to be talking about how to build culture, how not to build culture, right? We're going to be talking a little bit about that. So we got a wide diversity of different topics, and we're going to be I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So for you guys that are listening in, make sure that you've got a pen and paper handy, of course, and we're going to put all of Victoria's social media links below. So looking forward to today, and make sure that you connect with her on LinkedIn. We'll remind you guys at the end. So without further ado, Victoria, welcome to the show. Thanks for having me, Adam. I'm happy to be here. Awesome. It's really good to, it's really interesting. I was looking through your LinkedIn profile, and it seems like you've got a bit of a fan base in regards to your public speaking and stuff, right? I do. I'm sure we'll probably have a conversation around personal brand, and I'm very clear that Victoria Pelletier is more than a title and the company I work for. For all the values and things I stand for, I joke that I'm a multi-potentialite. And on my speaking work, yes, I get a lot of people who will comment and post, and I'm gracious when they called me rock star out there. That probably goes a little bit more to my head, given that I would have wanted to have actually been one. It's really interesting. Like one thing that I observed, especially during our conversation, is that I don't know. There's this, I speak about this a little bit when I'm speaking to other sort of people here, I guess, on the show. But there seems to be this kind of like, high energy, high vibrational energy from you. You come across extremely confident, extremely, like powerful in terms of like who you are and where did that come from? Because I know that you do specific talks on this, don't you? Tell us a little bit more about that. Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think it comes from a multitude of places, Adam, from the fact that I'm tall for a woman, and I hit this height by the time I was 11. So in my head, I feel like I'm 6 feet tall. I'm 5'8" and shrinking by the day. My mom put me into modeling when I was younger because
I'm adopted, so they didn't know how tall I was going to be. Of course, every mother thinks their child is exceptionally beautiful, but she also thought it was going to help break me out of my shell to some extent, because the extrovert you see in front of you now wasn't always. And so I had the opportunity to stand on stages quite early. That modeling worked its way into acting. But what I will tell you, so there's a confidence that comes in standing in front of audiences, but I wasn't always confident speaking as Victoria, right? Wearing a mask, I could play a character. And so it came from that. It also came from the fact that early experience in the workplace, I felt like I needed to show up very differently because I was so much younger. And I'm not a fan of fake it till you make it, but confidence is the one thing that I leaned into. I made myself come across as though I was confident, even though I was like, had butterflies and scrambling inside, to the point that I did that enough and leaned into that discomfort that now it's just completely natural and quite honestly innate in who I am and how I show up.
Interesting. So when regards to kind of leaning into that kind of like confident figure that you saw, there must have been some sort of, would you kind of like comparing yourself to somebody else? Did you have was there like a role model that you were kind of like aspiring towards? And what was the premise behind that?
So I never had a formal role model that I aspired to, but rather I sort of manifested the way in which I wanted to appear standing in front of an audience, whether it was just a boardroom table or once I started speaking on stages. And that was, I manifested that I was going to, come across as confident, so people would believe in what it was that I was talking about. I knew that I need to be engaging or people would tune out. And this is long before I've been speaking for almost 20 years now. I mean, now everyone's multitasking on their phone. And if I'm going to hold their attention, then I know I need to captivate them somehow, inspire, motivate them, engage with them as an audience. So the role model was the vision of what I thought I needed to be standing on stage. So it was probably more of a fictitious character that I would model myself after, more around the characteristics and actions I knew I needed to demonstrate to stand in front of people.
So as like speaking, is that kind of like, I mean, you mentioned speaking numerous times in just a couple of minutes. Is that something that you from a young age, you saw yourself on the big stage, whether it be, I don't know, whether it be a kind of standing on Broadway or whatever it might be? Like, what sort of speaker did you want to become?
I didn't have visions of being a speaker. I did start acting very early, and I loved being on stage. I'll tell you, I did some commercial work and some print work, but I always loved being physically in a theater on stage because you immediately had an audience reaction. So I had desires of growing that, but I was also incredibly pragmatic. I bought my first house at 19 and had a mortgage to pay. So I had no delusions of grandeur that I was going to go and make it in Hollywood. So when I shifted at some point, it wasn't natural. I needed to, as an executive, speak at conferences where we were partners at, or to try and pitch. I've been predominantly in a business to business capacity my entire career. So selling to other businesses. And so that meant being on stages. That it wasn't what I planned to do. And the first few times I had to do it as Victoria on a stage, talking about business or talking about leadership or whatever it was in the early days, wasn't natural for me. Me becoming a professional speaker came later in life. And again, a lot of that was to do with what I felt when I spoke. And then also when I started to share a very different message and be more vulnerable, I even got deeper connection and reaction from audiences. And that's when I'm like, I love this. I have to do this on a much greater scale than I am today.
It's interesting. It's when, I don't know about you, but when I speak, it's kind of like this adrenaline rush. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like you get this adrenaline rush, but it's kind of a mixture of adrenaline versus butterflies. Like remember that first date that you went out on, and it was like kind of this feeling of butterflies in your stomach, and it's like, oh, this is kind of weird. All these different feelings and stuff like that. Anyway, I digress. Now, interesting enough, because you become, I'd love to know how you end up getting into kind of the executive world, becoming CEO at the age of 24. That, that's an amazing achievement. What was, I mean, tell us a little bit more about the background on that. Was there, I mean, you know, the person that was running the company, what did they see in you in terms of your qualities and thought, you know what, this girl, she's going to go some places or whatever it is? I'd love to kind of get some backstory on that.
Yeah, sure. I did have plans on being a lawyer, but I worked for a bank while I was in university, and a voracious learner and trying to improve myself. And so I took additional courses to allow me to do more within the bank. And I should also note, Adam, I started working at age 11. And by 14, I worked in a shoe store and I was the assistant manager. So I came into leadership very early. And so when I was working in the bank, I got promoted up through the ranks and to lead larger scale operations across a different areas within it. Because, for example, I'd taken my securities license. I'm originally from Canada, so I had my Canadian securities license. So I was able to run large scale operations for the brokerage. And so when an executive recruiter came knocking on my door, it was because I was already I think I was director level at that point within a large Canadian bank, running massive large scale contact center operations with financial services experience. And the executive recruiter, third party, was looking for someone with contact center experience and particularly banking, because many of it was an outsourcing company I was working for, and many of their clients were banking. And so I met many of the ticks in the boxes were met or achieved. Not all of them. So that COO role was, general manager role where technology reported to me, HR, sales, marketing functions that I hadn't had accountability for before. But what I think the CEO saw in me, and, he was older than me, but he, wasn't, gray haired yet himself. I'm going to bet he was maybe 40 at the time. I was 24 and a new mother, and I had many, many years of experience behind me. And I will tell you, I never disclosed my age initially, but if I ever got backed into a corner, I lied. No woman lies about her age, making herself older, but I did for a number of years for sure. And then, I think he trusted me. Again, I showed up with confidence. Now, good and bad, confidence is often seen as competence. And that's not always the case, but I was a competent leader as well. And I built the bridge between all of the areas of experience that I'd had and what lessons I'd learned into how they were going to be able to be successful. And in the areas where there still remained a gap, I talked about my ability to attract and retain leaders who would have skills and experience that I didn't, and build this trusted team around me for us to ultimately, deliver for him.
Love that. Some very cool stuff. How did you, I mean, I don't know how big the team was that you were leading and stuff, but did you ever feel intimidated being so young? And did you feel like, especially for older members of the team, that have maybe been there for like 15, 20 years, that maybe have this kind of like, I don't know, what's the word I was looking for? This kind of like, not jealousy, but it was this kind of like, I suppose this, I should be there type of thing. Do you know what I mean? Like I deserve that position. Do you know what I mean? And what's your thoughts of that? Did you ever come across that?
I did. So at that particular company, the other thing I failed to mention, I think part of the reason that CEO hired me is he had founded that company, and I'm going to describe him as a little bit scrappy. And I think he saw that in me, and the ability to roll up my sleeves and get in dirty and do there and deliver. And in that company, I did feel I had massive imposter syndrome. I was 24 years old. And although I had many years of experience, I was still only 24. The majority of the other people that sat around that table with me were at least 2 decades older than me. And I was also the only woman. That sort of, it created a bit of this barrier. And I later got this unfortunate nickname as the Iron Maiden, not just from that company, but from a couple of others. I felt like I had to show up with a mask. I wasn't going to show any emotion or vulnerability. I was going to go in and demonstrate. I was going to perform, and I was going to demonstrate that I had the maturity and skills and experience to be there. And a number of years later, that when I learned of that nickname, I was like, oh, that's not a role model. That's not who I'd want to work for. So I had to learn to be a little bit different and be vulnerable and show emotion and much more care and compassion. But on the age piece, I did have it at another company. I had gone in subsequently, and been hired as the senior vice president within an organization reporting to their CEO. And I had a couple of fellow colleagues that sat around the table that didn't have the S in their title. They were VPs. And there was very much a, what is she doing coming in here? I've been working here for 10 years. She's come in more senior than us. I think, again, I was younger than the colleagues. And so it was a very difficult situation. I was aware of it. I mean, this one in particular individual made it very difficult for me. He was very openly hostile as a result of that. And so it took patience and professionalism from me to try and, I'll say, win him over, but like demonstrate that I have skills. I've earned my seat at the table here, and let's just find a way to work together so that we're all successful.
Love that. So that, that's such a mature way of, doing stuff. And we'll go back. We'll actually come back to the whole kind of like premise of wearing the mask, because I feel like even in this day and age is that there's so many leaders out there that go around wearing a mask and try to be people that they're not. Do you know what I mean? And it's sad. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that, because that actually really that makes my blood boil a little bit. Purely, yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting topic. Anyway, so I know that you do a lot of speaking. I know that you kind of like in what I call a time of your life in transition. I suppose you're in a transitional period, aren't you? And trying to find things and stuff like that, which I love. I suppose experimenting as well, which is kind of a cool thing as well, kind of like, see where the next kind of opportunity comes. But from your perspective, like working in such senior roles from a young age, what do you think were your biggest learning curves from a leadership perspective? What were kind of like, were there ever a time where you ever felt uncomfortable? I mean, not just generally with people, but maybe with decision making or whatever it might be. Was there anything kind of like jumps out of your mind?
Yeah, there's been a few for me. That very first role was pretty pivotal in that I needed to trust in my capability to step into what was quite a stretch role for me, for sure. And that the other lessons I had to learn was, again, the mask I wore, how I showed up as a leader in my first few years as an executive. I'm not proud of. I live with no regret, and I don't have a regret, but I just think I could have done it so much differently. I wish that my 20-something-year-old self could see my 46-year-old self now and realize that it's okay to, again, be vulnerable, to be this really human-centered kind of leader. So that was one. The other would be, I've been through 18 mergers and acquisitions in supporting the companies I've directly worked for, not even naming the ones that I've worked with clients on. And the first time I went through one of these really large scale ones, I was relocated for my first time. I'm a Canadian citizen, US resident now, and I'd been relocated from Toronto to New York to help integrate. We'd acquired a number of like US companies and come in, and I was leading operations where the majority of the people sat. And although I'd gone through reorganizations within, by necessity within other businesses, I'd never done it to this scale, and understanding the relationship dynamics that came with the people that came over through acquisition. So I say that ultimately I was successful in that, but there was some stumbling along the way, and I needed to learn to be a little bit more mindful in everything from due diligence earlier and looking at different things for future acquisitions, to, again, leaning in a lot more deeply into the talent side of the acquisition and ensuring it was going to be successful.
Nice, like that. Some very cool stuff. What did you feel like? Because you mentioned around, you wish like if you was to be able to jump into a time machine and being able to change a few things or whatever it might be, you'd mentioned that. But in terms of like improvements, I mean, obviously you've evolved as a person over the last 20 odd years, right? We all do. But I guess, like, from your perspective, what would you say that, based on where you're at right now, do you feel like there's still improvements to be made along the way with regards to the sort of the role of, your leadership style or whatever it might be? What's your kind of take on that?
I think we can always evolve and improve, for sure. I feel a great deal of content's probably not the right word, but I'm happy with how I've evolved as a leader. I do still think I will continue to evolve, but it's an area where I think I've worked the hardest to excel. But there are still areas of who I am as a human and how they show up in business, period, that I would like to improve. I'm not sure in some cases I can. So patience. I am not a patient individual, and period. And so I can try to improve or master. I don't know if you master that. I can try, but I also know that it like really innately is just, it's not in my A-type personality. So instead, what I've learned is to show up differently in different ways. So I also operate at a pace that's faster than most. So I know that as a leader, I need to slow down. I need to let people catch up. I need to let people manage my expectations with facts and data behind it to support that if I'm asking for timelines and things like that. And so that's probably the area where I will continue to need to spend the more significant amount of time on myself, either improving or just recognizing that I need to do some things differently because I can't change completely.
No, that's cool. I like that. Some good stuff. Now, I want to kind of like jump in here a little bit because I know that we've spent quite a lot of time like talking about some personal stuff, which is kind of cool. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about like culture, because I know that a lot of our listeners are, a lot of them are with smaller companies, and I feel like we haven't really touched too much on the whole kind of culture stuff, but you being in an executive role, I suppose you've been in small companies as well as large companies, right? So you've kind of like got a great diversity in terms of experience. What do you think from your perspective from a company that is, I wouldn't say is, well, I'm going to say is relatively new in terms of their growth, it's steady growth. For example, it could be a professional services company or whatever it is. And they want to make sure that they get their culture right from, it's not going to be right from, immediately. But if you were asked for some advice from smaller businesses and they said to you, Victoria, I want to be able to create a unique culture within the company and being able to build a company on our terms and have happy employees, engagement, and all kind of stuff. What would you say to those individuals? Like, what would be kind of like your, I don't know, top tips with regards to building thriving cultures?
Well, I'm a big believer, Adam, that culture is actually the outcome of a result of a lot of things. And a lot of people think, you just plaster on the wall a nice, vision, mission statement, and, thou shalt be. And, for me, it starts with creating a sense of purpose, quite frankly. So, I mean, if many of your listeners are entrepreneurs or founders, they've found purpose in hopefully in the work, in the business that they've created, and they are passionate about that. But consumers and employees today want to work for purpose, mission-driven organizations. So being really clear in articulating what that purpose, and mission is of the organization, and then learning how to bring that down to the individuals and how they can help support it. So you might be doing accounts payable, like they've hired an accounts payable person. Well, how does that contribute to the success of our organization overall? And so that's where I think it's the leader's responsibility to help, bring that down to the individual level. And I also think it's about creating the right kind of policies and procedures. I'm a massive, you said it in the bio around me, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are you creating policies, procedures in an environment where everyone feels like they can show up in their with a sense of belonging, bringing their whole selves, being open and transparent about who they are? And then it's also about the actions, the language, and the behaviors of the leaders themselves that demonstrate the committedness to the stated purpose and ideally the kind of culture that they want to create.
I like that. It's some really good value bombs. I love the fact that you've really condensed that down into something which is really simple. And for you guys that are listening in, there were a lot of value bombs that I picked up just by writing stuff there. So if you didn't quite pick them up, what I would recommend you do is pause the recording and rewind it. That's what I would recommend you guys do. Anyway, some good stuff. I like that. Now for you, here's an interesting part, because you're going to get, we also get a diversity of different listeners that are maybe in business for like 10, 20, 30 years, right? And I feel like some of those companies, they can be stuck in their ways. Do you know what I mean? They get a little bit kind of complacent. They have the mindset of, oh, that's just how things are done around here type of thing. You know what I mean? And you probably heard this before, right? Being in sort of working for sort of large and small companies. How do you deal with leaders that have that kind of mentality in terms of like, you'll get like, I don't know, a fresh face that comes into the business that wants to make a good impression, but then you're faced up against what I call resilient, hard-assed, leaders that have been there from like day one, and they have this kind of like fixed mindset. What's your what would you say? What advice would you give to that kind of like young, go-getting sort of, leader that wants to make a difference, but they're really faced with, some would call them assholes, if you like, however you want to call it. But how would you deal with that situation? Have you been in a situation like that similar?
So I have. In fact, in one of the acquisitions that I referenced earlier, it took me 1 full year with one of the leaders to get her on board with recognizing that there was a different way for us to be doing business and using new tools and technology to support our clients. Now, would I always wait 1 year? No, but she was critically important to the client, who was critically important to our business. So there's times where that was an exercise in patience for me. But again, understanding the outcome, and so what I'd say is, there's going to be a multitude of those people. So for that, young or old person who has to deal with those, hard-headed individuals who are not prepared to recognize that there's a different way of doing things, I think a lot gets built on trust and rapport. And so building that with the individual, who will then start to listen potentially to a different perspective, again, because they've built that kind of relationship with you. I also think that it's around having the data and fact to support it. I mean, just coming in with a whole lot of intuition without experience and data to support it will certainly be helpful in that regard. And also this like stick-to-itiveness. I mean, I'm the type who I don't take no for an answer. And I'm the type who wants to break things, so I do get to put them back together again. I hate the status quo. And so I also choose for those individuals, and I'm not saying immediately, but, find the right kind of environment, going back to culture, the right kind of environment that's going to suit, you and your personality and the way in which you want to work. There's still going to be, people all around, but again, building their trusted relationship with them, understanding, sharing your experience, understanding the data points to try and help bring them onto your side. And then lastly, I'd say, Adam, there's a hierarchy for a reason. So consensus is great, but at some point the hierarchy matters and someone gets to make a decision. And then you work through, to the best of your abilities, the change management process to get as many people on the bus proverbially as possible.
Love that. Some good stuff. I love that. Now you mentioned that you've been part of like at least 18 different management acquisitions, which is a phenomenal amount. You'll be lucky if, in people's lifetime to be part of just 1 or 2, right? But 18 is quite phenomenal. What do you like from a leader's perspective? And I'm just thinking it from a leader's perspective here. And there's a lot of, especially when a company acquires another company, or if you are selling, to whichever remit that you decide. But from a leader's perspective, I was going to ask you, like, what are some of the, I wouldn't say duties, but what would you say are some of the ways of leadership in terms of like the style of leadership? How does it change in terms of like, because some people might be thinking, well, this is the end, right? It's the end. Our jobs are gone. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the kind of this level of insecurity then kicks in. But I was just kind of curious to know from your perspective, from a leadership perspective, like if we've got clients that are listening in and they're looking to either acquire or sell, should we act as leaders? Number one, that's the first thing. But also, like, how can we still get the best out of people, knowing that there is an end game at the end of it?
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, it's different in terms of you're selling or you're buying in terms of the early stages of due diligence, et cetera, and how I'd recommend to your audience. But let's assume a transaction's been completed, from the acquiring organization, and even for the company that's been acquired, lots of times there's an expectation to stay for a transition period or 1-2 years, whatever afterwards. And so I think it becomes really important for those leaders to do a few things. So first, where I see a lot of these M&A deals go wrong is around the change management component of it. Mm-hmm. And this it is like multi-pronged in that one, these companies go, hey, I have a project management office, a PMO that does change management as we implement new clients or new technology all the time. This is different on a whole other scale. And so if they haven't had experience in how to write communications and build a plan around that, that's one. Two is not having a dedicated team around that and expecting that everyone's going to do their day job plus all the integration work that needs to go on. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. It's not like any companies are sitting around with like people who are only doing a majority of their people doing like 50% work and have capacity to take this on. And the last thing is, there's more than that, but the other thing I would focus on is around the leadership, the communication, the being as incredibly transparent as possible. And in these situations, you can't always share everything, certainly, but to the extent that you can do, right? And say, like, so for me, like in bringing leadership teams together, I've said, look, the company is expecting that as a result of this acquisition, there's going to be some synergies. So some people are going to lose their jobs. I'd rather say that up front, but also say, we're not doing death by 1,000 cuts. We're going to go through this as leaders. You're going to help me decide, like, we're going to work through this together and manage it that way. And that also, again, that once we do it, I hate the death by 1,000 cuts. I've been in one organization where it was just constantly, so people always lived in fear. And so doing it that way. And then again, building like a lot of, trust and rapport with others. I use that example of that one woman. It took me a year. Now, had I not invested in the time and done some of this was due diligence around understanding how important she was to our client, I could have made an earlier decision to say, she's so incredibly difficult, I'm going to exit her. But I could have potentially lost that multi-million-dollar client as a result.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess it depends on the value that you put the other person on, right? So it's a good point. That some good stuff. Now, I know that you mentioned earlier on the whole kind of like wearing of masks type of thing, and I think I had a rant maybe about 2 or 3 months around the whole kind of like being authentic and showing vulnerability and stop wearing a mask type of thing. I think it was about 2-3 months ago, whatever it is. This is like, actually, this is probably one of my, from my perspective, Victoria, is like, I suppose it fascinates me because it's kind of like, you're kind of going deep with regards to people's thought processes more than anything else. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, like, this whole kind of like mask charade, whatever you want to call it, right? Do you have any advice for some of those leaders that, even when they're showing themselves up on places like LinkedIn, for example, like you get a lot of this, right? Where, you can see that there's a disconnection between the person, what they're saying to what they're actually doing in terms of showing up. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, people aren't stupid. Like, people can pick signals up. Do you know what I mean? It's like, no, stop doing that, right? You know what I mean? So in terms of like, from your perspective, like what are some of the biggest mistakes that leaders make with regards to, that whole kind of mask wearing and, being the person that they're not really supposed to be? What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes that they make in terms of like, whether it be kind of putting yourself out there, whether it be building a personal brand, like you mentioned before, and whatever it is? What have you found as some of the biggest mistakes that people make?
I think that people's individual experience and own insecurities inform the way they show up in business, and lead their people, and that leads to their downfall, quite frankly. And by that I mean, I think someone might have had a really poor experience as they were earlier in their career, and they've taken that with them everywhere they go. It doesn't mean all leaders, so they choose to act in a very different way. I had at one company a person who he'd come from a pure partnership type environment with equity, and the way that dynamic worked as he then came into a publicly traded company, and that dynamic and how he would show up, he needed to make sure that when he met with teams who he needed to work with them, they weren't all his direct reports. You work in a highly matrixed organization, you're working through that indirect reporting system. I needed to say to him at some point, like he would tout to everyone, well, I'm the partner here. I'm like, okay, everyone's got that. We can look up your title. So like how do we get people on board? And so, for me, it was sitting with him and having a conversation. And I know that comes from his, a prior experience, and that's what's informed. But I also think there's this, I talked about insecurities, and there's a fear of failure. There's a fear of rejection. And so people put on whatever mask or persona they think they need to prevent anyone from seeing the cracks in the armor. And again, it shows up as you said, Adam, like fake and not believable sometimes, or just you just don't like that person. And so, my advice is to be your authentic self. If your audience goes and looks me up online, I can guarantee that if anyone ever worked with me or meets me in person, there is no difference in the Victoria that you are seeing online versus the person that you meet face to face. In fact, for the New Year post, everyone's writing, yay, so merry. I actually said, no, 2022 was one of the most difficult in my adult life. People might think by seeing my posts on LinkedIn and I've won some awards and things like that, things are so amazing. But I'm like, no, let me tell you what it looks like. But that goes back to my resilience, my unstoppable nature. And so it's all connected. So I feel like it's so abused when people talk about being your authentic self and being vulnerable. But at the end of the day, I can tell you from firsthand experience that has materially made a difference for me in my own leadership and the kind of followership I've subsequently built.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I love the fact that you picked that up kind of, the whole kind of like, you attract who you want to become. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? It's like, and I don't believe in the whole kind of fake it before you make it crap. I think it's kind of like very much, pre-2019 type of thing. You know what I mean? So it's just, I get that. And it's interesting because, and I'm so glad you kind of shared that whole kind of like, 2022 was kind of difficult because we're also live in a very judgmental world. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, they're doing so well. Oh my God, they won so many awards. Oh my God, they're on stages. It's like, but really behind the shell, is it all what it's made up to be? Like, are we really sharing our true colors, if you like? Do you know what I mean? It's like kind of like, but I suppose that kind of like intertwines into that whole kind of like personal brand kind of thing. If you, I suppose this kind of like, do you wear a mask because you want to be seen in a different light? But I suppose you picked up a really good point about the whole kind of people's insecurities, because really it comes to, who am I comparing myself to? Why am I, and that whole kind of feeling of being judged, right? And it's interesting just to kind of like where that thought process comes in people's minds. I just don't get it. Like authenticity was like, is as important in terms of my core values, but I guess it's easier said than done, right? That's what I'm kind of trying to get at.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about personal brand. I tie this back fundamentally to me doing the right thing, and me also, when I talk around culture being an outcome. It's about, do you feel safe showing up in this great sense of belonging? So for me, being my authentic self, me sharing my story creates the space and capacity for others to feel like they can do the same, and thereby builds the right kind of culture from a diversity and inclusion perspective that I would want on the, as my mission statement, but I can actually live it, but me demonstrating as a leader. So it's not just the right thing to do. It's not great for my personal brand. It's great for DE&I. It's great for my team all around. Like, I think people look at it and, as a, very finite, myopic reason to do these things. And the reality is it's just, brings benefits across all areas.
Very good. I know that we're coming towards the end of our conversation, but I guess like my thought process is saying to me, when we talk about leadership, right? So we think about leadership, we talk about a lot about leadership, how it's changed over the last sort of, since the time that you became COO compared to now, which is 22 years, a long time ago. But how do you see that in terms of the future of leadership? How do you feel that's going to change in terms of like how people show up online, to like the types of leaders that we're attracting into companies now? Are they very different type of thing? What's your thoughts behind that?
I think I feel very fortunate that I learned many years ago this style of being, not just leading, of being, because I believe that this is the expectation for how work should be done and leaders should be operating going forward. This hustle culture. Now I think the pendulum's swinging, and so I'm not saying it's not going to come back a little bit, but the focus purely on, hustle hard, will be balanced by different types of metrics within a business. And so things like, ESG goals, are we all contributing to DE&I within our workplaces? What are we doing for sustainability? People want to work for, I mentioned at the start of this, purpose-driven organizations and leaders. And so I think that's very much the differentiator for the future, is we're all fighting for talent and then hoping to retain them as well. And so again, I feel fortunate to have done it because it felt like the right thing and I saw it working. But now particularly as I work with other businesses and coaching them on what transformation should look like, this is really what the demands of consumers and employees are now, and I suspect will be for a very, very long time.
I guess the whole point of the thought that, you mentioned around the whole kind of like, this is the way that things should be done. But I guess who sets that tonality? That's kind of like do you know what I mean? It's like, well, who says that? And, and I suppose for me, I'm a little bit of a disruptor in that way. It's like, well, yeah, I get that, but who said that type of thing? Do you know what I mean? It's like kind of a rule book that we're trying to follow here.
Well, I don't know. No, I mean, I think, Adam, look at like, Elon Musk has come in and bought Twitter, and, they had a very different culture in the way it was working before. And he's come in and it's like, this is what it's going to look like. And I think as an employee, you then have to make a decision. Now you might stay for a period. You might make a decision to say, I'm out. Like, this is not aligned with my belief system and how I want to work. And you'll stay there until you find another job, or you just outright quit. So I think CEOs and founders can make that decision, but understand the limitations that are going to come in terms of who's going to want to work with you, who's going to want to buy from you, or how far you're going to be able to grow. So again, you can make that decision, but it comes with specific outcomes.
Absolutely, 100%. Love that. Well, I know that we've covered we've covered a wide diversity of different topics today. Like literally, I know that we could go into so many different avenues, which we're not going to have time for, ladies and gents. But for you guys that have been listening in, and listen, it's been a really fascinating conversation, because I don't think we've ever had on the show someone that's had, someone that's been in C-suite kind of senior executive roles, that's kind of transitioning into like, full-blown speaker type of thing. I kind of love that. I've never come across that myself, because I feel, I was saying this to Victoria, I was like, normally with most people that are either running their own business or they're in C-suite or whatever it is, normally most of those people suck at speaking. It's normally like death by PowerPoint type of thing. Do you know what I mean? You ever get those types of leaders that, and they still exist today, by the way, heavily. I just wanted to point that out to you, by the way. So it's so funny. Anyway, I just wanted to say, Victoria, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
For you guys, I hope that you've enjoyed today's show. Do me a favor, if you have enjoyed today's show, do get in contact with Victoria if you are interested in bringing in her as a speaker, getting her, should we say, her areas of expertise in terms of leadership, culture, social selling, personal branding. We're going to put all of her links below. Feel free to check that out. And if you've enjoyed today's great show, please do me a favor, give us a 1 or a 5-star review over on Spotify and Apple. I would greatly appreciate that. That'll be super awesome. Anyway, from me, Victoria, just want to say thank you so much for everyone, and hopefully you have a great day. Speak to you soon, and take care. Cheers now. Bye-bye.